In many respects, Benedict XVI was the Pope who got a bad rap. Nearly 24 years as Pope John Paul II's doctrinal enforcer and a German childhood lived in the shadows of Hitler's Nazi regime, he was often unflatteringly referred to as God's Rottweiler or the Panzer Cardinal. Years of negative publicity caused many of his accomplishments to go unnoticed. He was the first pope to go green, making the Vatican the first country in the world with a zero-carbon footprint, putting solar panels on its rooftops, and bringing in electric vehicles, including a hybrid Pope-mobile. He was cardinal and pope during the years when the Catholic Church's sex abuse scandals came to light, and he spearheaded the Vatican's efforts toward a zero-tolerance policy. It was too little too late for some, but it was Cardinal Ratzinger who organized the Vatican's response to the scandal, including creation of a special office at the Vatican to handle cases, extending and in some cases eliminating the statute of limitations for victims, and as Pope, publicly apologizing.
Indeed, I am deeply sorry for the pain and suffering the victims have endured, and I assure them that as their pastor, I too share in their suffering.
One of his first acts after being elected Pope was to condemn a popular church figure, Father Marcel Maciel, for sex abuse, something which had not happened sooner because of Maciel's close friendship with Pope John Paul II. The high-profile condemnation diffusing concerns that Benedict wanted to cover up scandal. However, after his retirement, he suffered a reputational blow when a church-commissioned report found he knew about allegations and failed to act against a pedophile priest while he was Archbishop in Munich 40 years ago. Benedict denied the allegations. And the surprise for which he will go down in history, being the first pope in modern times to resign, showed that the man everyone thought of as a traditionalist was unafraid of bucking the biggest tradition of them all, that a pope doesn't step down. True to form, he made the historic announcement in Latin, saying he lacked the strength of mind and body to continue as pope. But this tough traditionalist was also a softie. He loved cats. Chico and Contessina were two. And classical music. Mozart's clarinet concerto was a particular favorite. Within the Catholic Church, Pope Benedict was a towering intellectual figure, one of the last to have attended the historical Church Council Vatican II in the 1960s. He authored hundreds of books and articles and was as much a hero to conservatives as a controversial figure for others. A famous speech in Regensburg in 2006 that Benedict said was misinterpreted, questioning the link between Islam and violence, sparked protests against the Pope from some in the Muslim world. His resignation introduced the biggest change of them all, an era of two living popes. Although he vowed to retire to a life dedicated to prayer at a monastery inside the Vatican, the Pope Emeritus continued to exert influence during the Francis papacy, weighing in on debates over sexual abuse and celibacy by writing articles and books well into his 90s.
Cari fratelli e sorelle.
He had retired as Pope, but not as a major player in the Catholic Church, an influence likely to continue even after his death.
Father Reese, let me ask you this, your just initial reaction to the news of Pope Benedict's passing.
Well, of course, it's not a surprise. Pope Francis announced earlier in the week that Benedict was very sick and declining, and so we knew that this was going to happen. But it's still a time to mourn his passing, but also to celebrate his ministry of service to the Church.
And Delia, just want to get your perspective in terms of what Pope Benedict's legacy is to you.
Well, personally, I've known and followed Pope Benedict and Cardinal Ratzinger. I was actually taught theology by a former student of his, so I have been fairly deeply involved with Cardinal Ratzinger's theology first, and then when I came to the Vatican, I, of course, met him personally. And one of the things that sticks out about Pope Benedict, and when people ask me about him, is the dichotomy between his public reputation and personally meeting him. It's very kind of alarming to sort of meet him in person when you realize he's such a sort of kind and humble and person of great intellectual and cultural breadth, so that he had the capacity to focus in on you and say something about whatever you were talking about, which you hadn't thought of before, in a fresh and new way. I think there's very few people who are original thinkers in such a way that Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, was. I think that in terms of his passing, it is the end of an era for the Catholic Church. He was the last Pope and Cardinal to participate in the Second Vatican Council, which was a major event in the life of the Church. And I think that he is respected by both progressives and conservatives for his intellectual breadth. It's what he wanted to do, a professor, a theologian. In fact, he tried to resign several times under John Paul II. He eventually did resign as Pope. This is a man who didn't want to be Pope. He said a few days after he was elected, when he heard his name being called in the Sistine Chapel, he felt like he was being led to the guillotine. This is a man who felt he was called to be a theologian and write his books, and I think that that is the legacy that he leaves to the Catholic Church.
Father Rees, there are many ways that we will, of course, remember former Pope Benedict, but perhaps for most people it will be the fact that he stepped down, something that hadn't been done in hundreds of years. And I'm wondering just how controversial was that at the time?
Well, it was a big surprise at the time. No pope had done this in 600 years. And the result is that now future popes are going to find it much easier to resign if their health deteriorates to the point where they can no longer function in the job. This is important because modern medicine can keep the body alive long after a person is capable of doing such a stressful job as being pope. So it's important, and the fact that he, who many consider a very conservative pope, was willing to do this allows future popes to do it with no challenge at all.
And Delia, obviously we've been hearing comparisons between Pope Benedict and his successor, Pope Francis. I guess tell us a little bit more about their differences and how different they are from each other, and especially in terms of their leadership in the Catholic Church.
Well, in terms of their leadership, of course, they're completely different personalities. I mean, Pope Benedict, as I said, was not one who wanted the job of Pope because he understood that he was an introvert. He didn't have the ability to meet a lot of people all day, to be in front of the cameras, to make those gestures of John Paul II or Pope Francis. They're sort of naturals on the world stage. Pope Benedict didn't have that. I wanted to mention also in terms of his resignation that Pope Francis just 2 weeks ago said in an interview that he has already written a letter of resignation in the case that he should become incapacitated. I think the resignation of Pope Benedict had two aspects. One, it showed his great interior strength. When he spoke about his resignation afterwards, he said he was very serene about it because he spoke about it with God. He had a very deep spirituality, and he was very sure of himself in that way. It was a very courageous move. I mean, absolutely floored everybody. But Pope Francis just 2 weeks ago said, I've written a letter of resignation in the case that I become incapacitated, and nobody blinked an eye. And that's because Pope Benedict had the courage to do that first. Amra?
And real quick, Father, I was just thinking on the fact that Pope Benedict had to follow in the footsteps of the incredibly popular Pope John Paul II, and I'm wondering just how difficult would that have been for him?
Well, I think it was difficult, although they were very similar in terms of their theology and their policies with regards to the church. They were very different personalities. Benedict really at heart was a German professor. He saw his role as a teacher, and this is what he always wanted to do. And this is where his stress was. He wasn't the greatest manager. He did not surround himself with really excellent people. But he was someone who clearly articulated the tradition of the church. Whether that was convincing for everyone or not is the question.